thank you to the whole Alliance team for curating such an inspiration-filled and much-needed Friday for all of us already. My name is Jasmine Rashid. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Strategic Partnerships at Candide Group, based here in Oakland, California. I hope everyone in the Bay Area is having a great morning so far. You have your coffee, your tea, your snacks. And if you're like me, you may also want to have your favorite notebook with you or your notes app open, because every time I get the pleasure to hear these two incredible individuals present, I'm filling up pages with learnings and ideas. So I couldn't be more excited that we get to pick the brains of these two panelists this morning. And before I ask Nwamaka and Rodney to introduce themselves and just a little bit about their work, I want to lay some grounding for what we're going to try and get into in the next 45 minutes or so. Equitable quality of life, access to capital, community power, and the health of our planet are far from the level of prioritization and democratization where we frankly need them to be in 2020, especially when it comes to the real-time effects on our communities of color. That being said, we're also existing in a time and space where communities are unapologetically forging their own paths by challenging and changing local systems so that we do get closer to this idea of a dignified economy. We're going to explore in this conversation the idea of restorative economics, not just as a theory, but as something that's actively happening around us. And it's happening with the help of brilliant, badass strategists who are deeply invested in the lives of their communities, like Nwamaka Agbo and Rodney Foxworth. So, Nwamaka, could you start by just giving us a taste of your background, what brings you to the conversation today, and also where people can go after today's conversation just to learn more about your work?
Sure. Thank you, Jasmine, for hosting us. Rodney, always great to be in conversation with you. So my name is Nwamaka Agbo. I use the pronouns she and her, based out of Deep East Oakland. And by way of introduction, I would say I come to this work out of a long-term social racial justice organizing background. I've done community organizing, electoral politics, policy work, and always really trying to understand what are the different levers that can be pulled on to really create systemic change that supports the needs of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And I found my way into the work of economy and finance kind of indirectly. The 2008 recession was something that deeply impacted me, and really wanted to understand just what was happening in our economy, and particularly how it was happening and what it meant for the social movements that were actively working to build power for impacted communities. And so to make a long story short, I tried to start learning about the emerging impact investing field and wanting to know more about the different ways that we can move capital in a mission-aligned way that really speaks to our values. And so that's kind of the way that I got to be here. And for people that want to learn more about my work, my website is just my full name, nwamakaagbo.com, and we will have a website for Katali Foundation next week. So, yay.
Awesome. And Rodney, same question, just a little bit about you, your work, what brings you here today, and where people can go to learn more about what you do.
Well, I'm really glad to have this conversation with the two of you. And Nwamaka, of course, I always just sort of follow her lead anyway into these types of conversations. So I'm the CEO of Common Future. We've been around for about 20 years next year. We were formerly the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, otherwise known as BALI, for those of you who are familiar with BALI. We rebranded last year as Common Future. We work with an extraordinary network of individuals that really represent and embody the types of values that we're going to be speaking about today. Individuals that are deeply present in their communities, really working towards transformative change in their local economies and really modeling different pathways for us all to hopefully follow. We also work with investors and funders to actually invest into and resource the types of strategies and approaches and just new paradigms that we see in our network. I come into this work, I've had a very diverse career. I think for me, it always starts with my own personal narrative and story. I live in Oakland, California, but I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is a city that is both beautiful and has all the challenges that we're all working against collectively today. Institutional racism, particularly anti-Black racism, mass incarceration, over-policing, challenges in terms of our environmental injustice, a range of things that you can really see present in Baltimore. I grew up in West Baltimore, working class, and really was able to see over time the dichotomy in terms of how our economy works, right? My parents really instilled in me a belief that you had to work hard, particularly as an African-American male, that you'd have to work twice as hard to get half as much. And I think just that whole perspective has really, it's been ingrained into me and kind of opened up my eyes as I've moved and progressed in my life. The other side of that is that I've had the fortune or privilege in many ways to actually see how sort of traditional ways of working as an economy has failed us, and actually working inside of institutions, large corporations, and seeing how the work is done inside of these institutions, and being able to have a perspective and actually have real insight into how we've gotten to this place of massive inequality, even in today. And so from my perspective, I try to bring as many skills and experiences I have to the conversation, particularly as we're talking about alternatives to the mainstream way of how our economy works and actually does not work for people. And so that's me, and as many short words and brief words.
Awesome. Thank you both. So just for some context setting, what do you mean when you say restorative economics for those who are new to the term? What are the, key pillars, if you can give us just a brief overview?
Sure, and I'm gonna do a quick screen share if I can figure out how to do this. So one of the things I'll start off by saying is that I think it's really important to ground this conversation in the fact that we are living in unprecedented moments, as a lot of folks have been sharing since the beginning of 2020. And one of the things that's really clear to me about the moment that we are in is that it has put structural racism under a spotlight in a way that people will continue to try to deny it. And I think what we're seeing and understanding is that the strategies that we've been trying to move to close the racial wealth gap have not succeeded. And if anything, what we've seen in this moment of COVID-19, while people are dying, while people are being hospitalized, while people are losing their livelihoods, the richest and wealthier continue to make and amass more money. And so in my work on restorative economics, what I try to really lift up is that we need to be really intentional about who we are investing in. So specifically looking at supporting those communities that have been systematically excluded and extracted from in our current economy. We need to also be very intentional about how we are investing in them. So how are we actually structuring the types of capital that we move to them, ensuring that we're moving capital in a way that's actually leaving more value in the community than we're extracting from them. And then we also need to be very specific about what types of projects we're trying to support. Through my work with restorative economics, I look at supporting projects that focus in on community wealth building, and community wealth building as a way of moving out of an extractive capitalist system and towards an economy that's rooted in regeneration. And so supporting projects that are building community governed financial infrastructure, equitable economic development projects, projects that take land and housing out of the speculative market, and within all of that, and understanding there's a set of capacity building that needs to happen to support these projects. And so for me, restorative economics requires us to be very explicit and hold a race analysis about how we are moving capital. One of the things I experienced early on when I started to kind of learn about finance and engage in the new economy space, as it's called in the global north and the global south, we refer to it as a solidarity economy. But one of the things I observed is that it was the individuals that had the flexible time, the risk tolerance, and the leisure capital to be able to kind of experiment with these new cooperative models. And those same individuals often ended up being whiter and wealthier. And so we're also seeing that in our effort to kind of create a regenerative economy, we were continuing to widen the divide because we weren't actually having a structural race analysis in how we were moving that capital. And so restorative economics calls us to really sit in acknowledging the harm that has been done to Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. It requires us to be in a point of reconciliation so that they can then be restored and be a part of the conversation and how we create a more equitable economy going forward. And really quickly, the other pieces that I'll add is that I look to support projects that are community stewarded. So I don't resource or support individual entrepreneurs, but instead support those initiatives where communities, community members, groups of organizations are coming together to collectively own and manage an asset together. And this is a way to kind of break us out of a model that's rooted in individual riches. And then also really lifting up the questions of not only what the project is, but how are decisions getting made about this asset and how it's used and stewarded in this community. And so inviting people to understand that governance is an opportunity to be an active daily steward of our community assets. And really being able to unlock or challenge the notion that governance is something that we do only once every 4 years and we go out and vote in an election, but we actually have the opportunity to engage in it on a daily basis. And that with all of that, while the work is to definitely create, to close the racial wealth divide and ensure that we are creating economic opportunities for these same impacted communities, that it's also about understanding that while we are building economic stability, we're also building political, cultural, and economic power. And so this is kind of a shorthand of how I think about restorative economics. I'm always trying to understand who is owning the asset together and how are people making decisions about how the asset should be governed together. And the hope is that by bringing these two pieces together, we're then able to engage in a conversation that starts to have more honest and direct notions of how to support those communities that need to be directly resourced in a strategic way. And so I will stop screen sharing. But that's kind of the quick hits for me on restorative economics. I mean, there's more to it, but we can unpack it as we talk.
Definitely. Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that grounding with us. And those graphics are always super helpful for me. So I always appreciate them. Rodney, with that understanding of the importance of community stewardship and community governance, this question usually gets asked at the end, but it's the thing that I always orient myself around. So I'm going to ask it now. But what are some of the tangible calls to action that you're seeing in the restorative justice space right now? Whether that's for funders, for activists, for community members, just give us some examples of what's really happening in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think when we talk about some of the calls to action, I will at least speak to sort of the funder and investor community, particularly in this moment, this multi-generational moment that we're all living through, with the combination of COVID-19, one of the biggest social justice uprisings that certainly in my lifetime that I've been able to experience. There's a lot of opportunity for sort of muddling the message and what people need to do, right? So what Nwamaka just shared is really a radical departure for the day-to-day process and practice that investors and funders operate from. And so it's really challenging that paradigm. And so one of the principal things when, Nwamaka speaks about community stewardship, political, cultural, social power, these are all things that funders, and I'm speaking with a broad brush, of course, but traditionally funders and investors do not think about the power dynamics. It's very implicit. It's not explicit. It's the air that we're breathing. It's very understood by those on the other side of the table, those who are not even at the table, who've been excluded. It's very much felt. But for funders and investors, there's a real call to action about how do you seed power in this moment so that you can actually ensure that there is real meaningful opportunity and resources and investment that orients towards community stewardship, that really orients towards self-determination. And so that's a really challenging proposition to offer to institutions and individuals who have not had to do that. In fact, have been incented not to. And so I think one of the biggest call to actions that we can, at least in terms of the funder and investor community, is to really reconsider and actually act on what it looks like to cede power. And so we see institutions that who may not have operated in this particular way, but you see them beginning to think more deliberately about how they can cede control and power and decision making over to communities that they have been historically investing in or have had some interest in relationship to, and really shifting the paradigm in terms of who's able to make the decision on the investment side, right? Is it a traditional investment committee? Are you actually bringing in people from the community, or are you going to them? Are you actually enabling and resourcing communities to actually build a table that they've already built and actually resourcing that? Those are things that we're seeing that we need to see more of from funders and investors. I'm really optimistic about it. I think to, some of the comments earlier about even though we're like most people are experiencing economic anxiety, are feeling the disproportionate impacts from our broken institutions, particularly in healthcare as it relates to COVID-19. However, in this moment, we're also seeing a concentration of power. We're seeing a consolidation of wealth, even more so than prior to. So it's almost this, we're at this precipice of we can go one of two directions. We're actually not going to go back to say March of this year. That's not going to happen. It's either that we're going to choose to actually make things worse, consolidate more and more power and wealth and control, or we're going to have an opportunity to actually disrupt that and resource and invest in things that Nwamaka has been speaking to. And so I think that's the actions for particularly investors and funders is to really grapple with this paradigm shift that really requires a change within themselves, within their institutions. I think once you've been able to clarify and switch the approach and the mindset, the technical approaches, right, to these models, that becomes a lot easier. Mm-hmm. The biggest piece is actually how do you get people to change their relationship to power, how they cede it without the demand itself. But I think we're in a moment right now that requires investors and funders to be able to cede that control and power and recognize how it actually, quite frankly, benefits them as well. To not be able to hold that sort of power, to not corrupt themselves in that type of way. And so that's sort of the call to action that I think about is funders and investors actually listening, ceding power control, recognizing the brilliance and beauty that is already in communities, quite frankly, just needs to be invested in.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Nwamaka, is there other calls to action along those lines, whether it's around the power dynamics issue or other tangible steps that people who are interested in really leaning into this work can take right now?
Yeah, I'll see if I can really add anything else to what Rodney had shared, but I think to put it into context, what I would offer in terms of a call to action is I don't know anybody that walked away from watching the debate earlier this week and felt inspired, right? Or anyone that has felt like, yes, either of these two directions is actually the right direction for what is going to move us not only out of this moment, right, but into the future. And I lift that up to say that for me, one of the call to actions that feels really important to lift up is, in addition to what Rodney has shared, is that we need to actually invest in transformation. And investing in transformation requires us to do all the things that Rodney had listed up. It requires us to be able to listen. It requires us to be able to cede power and control. And I want to be clear that ceding power and control is not to necessarily just abdicate your power and say you don't have any responsibility. It does require you to still be engaged and show up in the conversations. And one of the things I always try to invite people to, like as people are experimenting with democratizing the control of the resources that they have, is that there's still an invitation for them to bring their technical skills and expertise and people that know how to structure investments and people that know how to move capital and fundraise capital to still support those projects. And so being able to understand that there's so many ways, not just the financial, but also the non-financial ways that we get to show up and support these communities. The other piece that feels really important to just lift up and what Rodney also shared about power, particularly when it comes to finance. So much of the ways that we've done economic development has been about, well, let's go invest in this community and the community will get a set of social benefits, right? These social benefits usually look like jobs. They usually look like so much green open space. But we never actually spend time talking about who is getting the financial returns off of that same development project. And so the ability to also be very clear and explicit about who is owning these assets that are invested in, and who is then getting the financial returns off of them as well. And this is what helps us to really lean into how do we move from charity to solidarity. There's a way that charity feels very comfortable, right? Because we're doing grant making, we're giving it to communities in need. Solidarity requires us to actually share in the risk, right? When we see activists and organizers on the front lines, they are at risk, right? We actually know that they are putting themselves in harm's way in the hopes of creating a more equitable country for all of us. And so then what we need are those same types of investors and funders that are equally willing to share in risk, meaning that they may not get the financial returns that they're used to getting, but understanding that that is the risk that we take as a way of also being in solidarity with these activists on the ground. And so also helping people to understand the shift that we're asking them to lean into when we talk about being willing to engage in mission-aligned investing, being willing to really lean into what it means to redistribute wealth. And the last piece I really lean into about why this is particularly important. And, you know, Rodney, I don't know if you get this, but one of the pushbacks that people oftentimes give me about the communities that we look to invest in and support is that, well, they're just not profitable. And I beg to differ. I actually know and believe that the projects that we look to support and the ways that we seek to structure them, they are profitable, but they're not profitable in the ways that they're extracting or undermining or undervaluing their workers so that they can then give more returns to the investors. They're profitable in terms of really being in the long-term gain of what it means to invest in their community. And that's not a quick slash and burn investment. That is actually a long-term patient capital investment. And once they are actually profitable, I don't think that money should be coming back to investors, right, for their own benefit, right? If anything, maybe yes, the principal, but anything on top of that should actually continue to circulate in the community. And so we look to make sure that projects are profitable by supporting them through an integrated capital strategy over the long term. And we are very clear that we want their profits to stay in their community and are always looking to see how is this project rooted in right relationship with social movements on the ground, and how are they continuing to circulate the capital that they amass so that they're not continuing to kind of aid to further economic inequalities. And so I think just to like provide some context about the calls to action and what it means to really invest in transformation, invest early and often and deeply, and showing up with your full self, not just your financial resources, but also the non-financial resources that you can bring to bear and support these communities.
And thank you for that, Jasmine. Can I just follow up really quickly or try to? Thank you for that, Nwamaka. I think one thing in relation to the call to action that you signaled to me, I actually chose not to watch the debates because I knew that it was an act of self-care. To be real. However, what I will say was interesting is that I think in terms of a call to action, I actually think we need to understand, and I know we do understand this, but there were people who were inspired by that debate. And that's actually part of the problem. That's a significant part of the problem. And so, you know, when we talk about restorative economics, when we're talking about repair, there's an entire misunderstanding or lack of willingness to engage with the historic and contemporary context in which got us to this place, right? That we have to be restorative to begin with, that we have to be reparative, that there's wounds that need to be repaired, and that there's actually inspiration and excitement to continue to do what we have been doing from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and from a cultural perspective. So I think that's something for us as a community to consistently grapple with as, you know, how do we actually ensure that we're mindful of that reality? I know that we are, but I think it's a real It's a reality that must be confronted consistently, that there's actually excitement and inspiration in how we go about how this paradigm exists. And the final thing related to what Amaka was pointing out, this goes back to, the idea that I asked the question, what is the purpose of profit to begin with? What are we talking about? What is the rationale behind it? Why do we believe that we need to have 20x return on investment? Why do we believe that? And again, it goes back to power, right? And so there's that fundamental rethink into what Amaka was speaking to. Can those returns go back to community, right? Who's actually really bearing risk? Really, when people talk about risk, they're talking about the financial sense. And the reality of it is, when we actually look at our tax code, when we look at our policy, risk is over exaggerated within the context of what we're dealing with, right? And so when Amaka is speaking about what the actual risk on the ground, we're talking about the breakdowns of our infrastructure, and we're seeing with COVID-19, who's actually bearing the risk of our failing institutions, right? And so that's a part of the context that I think continuously we always have to think about as a community.
And it goes back to the thread of the folks who are able to mitigate risk understand the problems, because they're often closest to the problems and therefore closest to the solutions. And so picking back up that thread of why we need to be rooted in community, and how restorative economics, at least to me, is fundamentally about real relationships, these long-lasting relationships. How do we relate to another and cooperate for a better collective future? It's not an easy question, but as we think through collaborative processes between investors, funders, communities, activists, how do we consistently center the conversations on those who have systemically been blocked from the conversations? How do we keep that intentionality always at the forefront?
Amaka, do you want to begin, or you want to?
I'll try. Yeah, no, I think that's an important piece to raise, Jasmine. And it's and on one hand, it just feels really obvious and simple that you actually have to be talking to people on the ground, right? And I think this is why it continues to be so important to resource organizing work. Because organizers are talking to their neighbors, they're talking to people they pass by, they understand how to connect with people in a way that, investors who aren't familiar with the day-to-day challenges that people who are under the most duress may not be able to know how to have that conversation. And so always being able to ask ourselves, who is not at the table, right? How can we create more opportunity to have as many voices as possible participate in the conversation? How do we ensure that communities that have been denied access to financial literacy, denied access to financial institutions, have the skills and the capacity to then meaningfully engage in these conversations as well? So there's an aspect of capacity building and human development. There's an aspect of leadership development, and there's an aspect of really challenging ourselves. This piece that Rodney keeps lifting up to really democratize the power and being willing to take direction and learn from those that are on the ground and at the front lines. And I don't think that this needs to be transactional. I think relationship is actually an opportunity to be transformational, and it gets to be transformational when we are learning from each other, when we are recognizing the multiple skills and resources that people bring to bear. I just kind of referenced the Buen Vivir Fund in the chat box, and one of the things that I really love about the way that Thousand Currents grantee partners have structured the design of the Buen Vivir Fund is that they don't look at their model or their fund just about the finances. They recognize the knowledge capital, the relationship capital, all the other resources that people bring to bear into a conversation. And so how do we cultivate relationships that are reciprocal and that are rooted in the understanding of our collective liberation and not just unilateral in terms of, I'm just an investor here to move money to you so that I can get as much returns as I want. And so the question is, are we willing to listen? And are we willing to apply what we learn from listening? And I think that's one of the clearest invitations for how we continue to come back and center the voices of those that are most impacted. But I'll also say, quite frankly, these communities are not waiting for us as funders or investors either. right? They are moving and doing the work. They have been light years ahead of us. And if anything, we're just now catching up to how we may be able to support and contribute to the work. So I think it's also important to humble ourselves a little bit and understand what it means when we have Indigenous communities really taking the just transition principles and applying it to their work. When we see projects like the Black Farmers Fund and Black Land Empower really looking at how do we create mechanisms for land stewardship and engage in regenerative agriculture and all the things around sharing capital and a resource. So these communities, while they are disinvested in, are also extremely resilient and have been able to continue to carve out opportunities to thrive on the fringes of our economy, and they'll likely continue to do so. We have the opportunity to figure out how can we show up and support and resource them as needed. But yeah, what about you, Rodney? What you got?
Listen, I mean, when you talk about humbling yourself, that is so much a part of this conversation and how you actually get into being in community, to be in relationship with people, to be able to build trust with folks and communities. Because I think there's this assumption that has been built up over time that those with the power and resource and investment actually know best, right? We consistently perpetuate this idea that this is the case. And in fact, that is very rarely the case. And that's so there's a humbling experience, sort of a humbling that has to consistently occur. There's also making sure that you actually that you understand the context that you're working within. It's not, so for example, I've performed most of my work in Baltimore, and I know that city and that community very well. For me to assume that I can step into the Jackson or in Oakland, where I now live, or Boston, and take certain approaches and tactics, and then it'll all work out. That actually is not. That's a false perspective, right? And so what one has to do is be able to humble yourself and understand the context. Begin to understand. Listen, as Nwamaka keeps saying, listen, and then follow through also. Right. Nwamaka spoke about accountability earlier. One of the challenges that for a lot of folks in the communities I'm speaking to, funders, intermediaries, et cetera, who are you accountable to? Right. Asking that question, like ensuring who you're accountable to. I think that's a part of the process, because you can listen, but if you don't follow up and be transparent, then that causes other challenges as well, right? Because it speaks to lack of accountability. The other part of this conversation is that, we have to, and again, I'm just speaking to the funder and investor side of this. We have to make sure that the people who are engaging in these conversations from the funder and investor community actually reflect the values and experiences of these communities. And so I can go on a long rant about the fact that 88% of executives in philanthropy are white. I can go on a long rant about sort of the educational barriers that are put up within these sectors that presuppose that certain degrees or universities or what have you are actually going to be materials for moving economies and communities that have been most historically extracted from and exploited. There's a whole paradigm that we have to extract ourselves from. And I think what's interesting on my own, when I think about even my own experience as a grant maker and an investor, and I've been fortunate to be in multiple sides of this, but over my career, even prior to coming into Common Future, I've been able to fund and invest in over 100 plus African-American, mostly Black women through various institutions. And I recall people coming to me, asking me, how was I able to do that? And it was never a challenge for me. It just never was. And I think part of that is because I already had some relationships. I had shared experiences, I had some understanding for context that enabled me to see brilliance where some might not be able to, the majority of folks that represent those funder and community and investor communities might not be able to see. And when I say might, they don't. And so I think part of that is this: how do we actually rearrange who's actually at the table to be able to facilitate and engage in these communities that have some lived experience that we just consistently devalue as it relates to this work. It's consistently devalued. And so I think that's part of the process as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Nwamaka.
I just wanted to share one thing. Thanks for looking it up, Rodney. One of the things that we've been looking at, or the way we've been structuring our team at the Katali Foundation, is really leaning into what it means to be a practice-based funder, right? And so we're trying to build a team of people that come out of that direct experience of having moved resources in this way, of having done community organizing, of what it means to actually try to be the project manager for a development project. And so that is also something that allows us to really understand how we show up and support these projects, because when they hit challenges, it's like, oh, we've actually experienced what it means when the building department is backed up and you can't get your permit and you have to pay expedited fees, and that impacts the bottom line. So that shifts your capital campaign and your financing strategy, all the things, right? But we can have that conversation with them from a place of, we understand, how can we help you problem solve, and how do we continue to show up so that once you hit a problem, we're not pulling out, but we're actually leaning in a bit more deeply. And so, and that's also then allows us to not only be sharing resources, but also sharing networks and knowledge and expertise as well. And so I do think that that shift of how do we actually support people that are at the front lines of doing this work, and give them more access to the tables, the spaces where resources are flowing, to inform how those resources flow, also allows us to be more strategic in how we support and resource these projects accordingly.
Yeah, and that actually was going to be something about my next question in terms of really governance. And again, who is at the table, who's able to decide what the table looks like. And I know, Nwamaka, you mentioned folks like Black Farmers Funds, Buen Vivir, but I was wondering if there's any examples of projects or orgs in the Bay Area in particular that you're really excited about right now, just in terms of what they're modeling with either their governance structure or the ways that they consistently center community. Another just maybe homework for folks in the audience to look up after this conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah. In the Bay Area, we're lucky to have a number of different projects. So we have the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative Initiative being led by Noni Sessions. And that is a really exciting model to figure out, how do you bring together community members, both as participants, but also as shareholders, to invest in cooperatively held real estate as a way of kind of stabilizing the real estate market. And I think they have a beautiful governance structure that's both about how they make decisions, but they also have a great capacity building structure. So in this moment of COVID, continuing to invite community into learning sessions to understand the work in the field a bit better. We also have projects like, I'll go to Richmond Land is a new initiative based out of, not newish, it's a few years old now, based out of Richmond, California. And this is an effort to create a community land trust and to really disrupt the traditional ways that economic development have been done. And so being able to organize community about setting the economic development priorities, and then also being able to engage with developers around how they move those projects in a different way that's actually rooted in the needs of the community. We have the Oakland Community Land Trust, which we know earlier this year was a part of really helping to negotiate the Moms for Housing fight against a speculative or real estate owner. We also have the Segorite Land Trust, an indigenous-led land trust that's really looking at the rematriation of land. I'm inviting people to engage in not only gifts for the organization, but gifts towards recognizing that we are on stolen, unceded indigenous land. The Real People's Fund recently launched as a community governed loan fund supported by Community Vision, but actually being mobilized and rooted in a number of movement building organizations like the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Communities for a Better Environment, Alliance for Californians for Community Empowerment. So there's so many great examples. Restore Oakland is another one. I can keep going, but I think all these projects are really showing that we get to experiment with what it looks like to govern. And I would say that governance is actually very challenging, right? It requires us to show up, and it requires us to be willing to make decisions that we know that have trade-offs, and decisions that we know aren't always perfect, but that's what it means to govern, and that's what it means to lead. And being able to have these projects as an opportunity for community to then be in a position to directly govern for themselves on their terms. And then we have the capacity and understanding, how do we show up to govern not only for this specific project, but for our community as a whole? And oftentimes in movement, we talk about, if we are not prepared to govern, we are not prepared to win. And so what we're asking people to lean into through the work that we do is understanding that these projects are an opportunity for us to ready ourselves for governing, because we know that we hope that we win come this November. And if we win, then we need to be prepared to lead and to govern. And these projects are an opportunity for us to start exploring what that looks and feels like in our specific community.
Amazing. Rodney, do you want to tack on some more to that beautiful list of abundance that I know there's tons more?
I won't tack on because but what I will say is that, to Nwamaka's point, you can go on and on, which is actually the inspiring thing, and also something to think about for, because I think you said, Jasmine, something about homework, and this goes back to our earlier part of our conversation, is that there's so much out there. There's so much that communities have been doing. And to Nwamaka's earlier point, no one's waiting for funders and investors. Folks are moving forward. We have an entire history in movement building that has proven this out. The capacity that communities have to self-govern, it's difficult like everything else, right? But one thing I will point out too around this is that this looks very different for so many funders and investors, right? And so again, the willingness to actually change your practice, to change your policies and your perspective, to actually be able to invest in and resource these types of examples is critically important. Because one of the things that Nwamaka pointed out earlier about, there's sometimes a question about, can this be profitable or what have you? And the underlying piece of that we don't often discuss is the fact that when you're centering the interest of the funder and investor that is assuming a particular type of return on investment that does not consider at all the community, well, we've already made a mistake there. And so much of this is that I like to say that, the challenge isn't, and this is not to say that capacity building and these sort of things are not important, but we don't talk about enough about the capacity building that is required for investors and funders to shift their own practices, to shift what they do, so that they can actually interface with these opportunities that actually do challenge, the script that they typically run through as it relates to making investments and making these decisions. And so I've oftentimes heard from funders and investors, wow, their governance structures look so unusual. I don't quite understand it. I'm a little concerned, because oftentimes they look at a traditional, quote unquote, traditional governance structure. And by the way, when I say traditional, what does that even mean? It's the mainstream, corporatized version of what governance might need to look like. So people are comfortable with that. And if it doesn't look like that, it gives people some pause. So again, I just want to keep emphasizing that there's so many opportunities, there's so many communities that continuously strive and are, resilient, that are building power without funders and investors. And so what are the things that funders and investors, intermediaries like my organization, need to be able to do to actually shift their own practice to ensure that we're partners in the equation and not actually barriers?
Definitely. We're coming up on time, so I'm going to hold some of the additional questions I laid out for future conversations that I hope to have with y'all. But just as we close out and go into the rest of today's conference, what do you want to share with those who have been in this work for a long time? I feel like we've been speaking a lot to folks who are new to the restorative economics space, or just the work of really diving into justice, but speaking to your peers, speaking to folks who are interested in what they should really be paying attention to now, in addition to their abundance of work, whether that's a message of some kind of optimism or hope, or a message of we need to all collectively do better on this one thing. I'm curious just what, if you had to just pick one main message to your peers, what would that be?
Yeah, just one is hard. I think I'm going to squeeze in two, Jasmine. I think if I could give what my first message would be, we can't be complacent, right? We have to actually be rigorous about the experimentation, and we need to move out of this habit that we have of wanting to find one right way, but knowing that there's multiple pathways, and wanting to kind of approach this work as if we were running multiple experiments that allow us to learn, iterate, and innovate faster. I think this, the other piece that I would offer is I invite people to reflect on what are you willing to risk so that all of us can win, right? And I've recently had conversations with a number of institutions that continue to say that they cannot shift their policies and the terms under which they give program-related investments or move investments because that's their policy. And if in this moment we are not willing to risk or challenge those things that we know are fundamentally not serving us and our communities, then when will we be ready? I think that is ultimately the moment that we're in. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Rodney?
Oh, man, so many things to say, and so I'll try to keep it to two. So one, I think, so this is it won't probably be inspiring or anything, but we existed. This is a beautiful struggle, right? This is a marathon. There's historical context to this. We're part of what has happened before us, and we'll be part of things that happen after us, right? And so one of the things I think about, particularly in this moment, I think, and Mike, I think we were on this call a couple of weeks ago, where there's this impetus, and we need to have urgency, and we have to recognize what we're dealing with now, but we also have to take care of ourselves in our collective community, right? And I think particularly when we're talking about Black folks, people of color, there's been the disproportionate weight of quote unquote solving these challenges is very clear. And the reality of it is like we have to ensure that, for example, Nwamaka is around for a long time, Jasmine, that you're around for a long time. We have to ensure that we are taking care of each other in that type of way. And I think this is also an opportunity for us to really think about how do we actually be able to invest in more and more leadership, right? To share in this struggle. And I am always profoundly inspired by how many people are doing beautiful work and how we need to consistently invest in them to continue, but also be able to cultivate more and more leadership that actually sees the world or begins to see the world in ways that we've been speaking about today. And so that's something that I would like to bring to the conversation. And finally, related to Nwamaka's point about risk, what are we willing to give up? Right? There might be some things that we just have to give up. We might have to position ourselves in a different way as individuals, as institutions. We might have to give something up in order to be able to gain something collectively, to Nwamaka's point, so that we can all win. And so I'll leave it at that.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm taking away just the points of, first and foremost, staying humble, always staying humble. This is a marathon. Investing time in one another, as in addition to capital, investing care in one another, and really being attuned to all the great work that's already in motion, that's already going on. So thank you both so much again for spending your mornings with us. I will pass it back to Naima, I believe. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.